The first time a man came to speak with my father about me, I was 17 years old, and what I remember most clearly is the sound of his boots on the porch steps. Three deliberate knocks of heel against wood, spaced evenly, like a man who had rehearsed even the way he arrived. He sat across the kitchen table with his hat resting on one knee and his posture so upright it seemed like something he had trained into himself, the way you train a young tree to grow straight against a stake. I watched from the hallway, through the narrow gap between the door and the frame, and something moved in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. He looked like certainty made flesh. I didn't know then what I know now, which is that certainty and trustworthiness are not the same thing, and that a man can sit with perfect posture and still be leaning away from you in every way that matters. I was courted by 5 men before I married. In the community where I grew up, a small, close knit Hutterite colony called Cedar Crossing, settled into the wide prairie country of southern Manitoba, that number was not unusual. If anything, it marked you as someone who had been careful, or perhaps as someone the men had found difficult to read. In Cedar Crossing, courtship moved along a path as worn and familiar as the lane between the colony buildings. A young man declared his intentions through the right channels, quietly, through an elder or a brother, because nothing important moved directly in our world. If the young woman was agreeable, visits began. They happened in the common room of her family's house on Sunday afternoons, with the door open and the family present and visible, a structure designed to protect everyone, and that actually, as I came to understand, protected something else entirely. My name is Nadia, and this is where I tell the things I was raised to carry in silence. If you want to hear what life inside that world actually felt like from the inside of it, I hope you'll subscribe and turn on notifications because I have more stories like this one, and I believe they're worth telling. What you were permitted to talk about and what you actually needed to talk about were almost never the same thing. You could discuss the weather and the planning schedule and the upcoming feast days on the church calendar. You could talk about family and colony work and the price of grain. What you could not do in those open-doored Sunday afternoon visits was say anything that exposed the true shape of what you were trying to learn. Is this person honest when honesty costs him something? When things go wrong between us, which they will, what will he do? Will he hear me? Or will he simply wait in patient silence for me to finish speaking and then continue on the course he had already decided on before I opened my mouth? Those questions had no place in the common room at Cedar Crossing. You were expected to feel your way toward the answers somehow, through God's guidance and your own best instincts. And if the answers stayed hidden from you, that was understood to mean you hadn't yet been still enough to receive them. The first man was named Tobias. He was, by every measure the colony had for such things, an excellent prospect. His family was respected. His work record was clean. He was tall and even-tempered and laughed at the right moments and had a way of listening to you that made you feel, while you were speaking, like the thing you were saying was the most worth-hearing thing said in a long while. On his second visit to our house, he brought a small jar of honey from his family's hives and handed it to my mother with something so natural about the gesture that my mother spoke well of him to my father for 3 days afterward. He came 6 times over 8 weeks. He asked me questions about what I cared about, what I noticed, what I thought the hardest part of a good life was. I answered him honestly each time, the way you answer someone you believe is truly listening. 2 weeks after his last visit, I learned through a cousin that he had begun approaching a young woman in a neighboring colony. Not a word to me. No acknowledgement that anything had ended because, in his mind perhaps, nothing had. What I had taken for courtship, he had treated as a kind of option, held open and then quietly let go. I spent a long time after that trying to understand what I had misread. Before I understood that I hadn't misread anything, I had simply believed the performance. The second man was named Eld, short for Eldridge, and my mother described him as steady. In Cedar Crossing, steady was high praise. It meant his work was consistent, his faith was unquestioned, and his household, when he eventually had one, would be run with a kind of orderly calm that people in our community understood as a blessing. What steady could also mean, as I discovered over 7 Sunday visits, was that Eld had built a wall around whatever lived inside him that was so well mortared that I could not find a single gap in it. I learned that he preferred the morning shift in the colony kitchen to the afternoon. I learned that he had a younger sister he was quietly proud of. I learned that he didn't like thunder, not because he said so, but because on one visit when a storm moved in fast from the north, I watched something tighten in his face that he smoothed over so quickly I almost missed it. But I did not learn what he feared. I did not learn whether he had ever in his life felt uncertain about anything he believed. One afternoon, I asked him, more directly than I should have by our customs, what the most difficult stretch of his life had been so far. He paused for what felt like a long time, and then described a summer, 2 years before, when a piece of equipment he was responsible for had broken down during harvest, and the repairs had taken 3 weeks longer than expected. He said this with the same even tone he used to describe everything else. I thanked him for telling me, and I understood, in the way you understand things that live below the surface of words, that this was as far inside as Eld would ever let anyone go. Not because he was a cruel man, but because he genuinely believed that this was the appropriate depth for another person to know him. The third man I will not name. I'll tell you only that he was older than the others, well established within the colony, and that his name carried the kind of weight that made people nod when it came up in conversation. A weight made of land and good conduct and a long family history of doing what was expected without visible complaint. When he began visiting, I felt something I didn't immediately distrust, which was the feeling of being truly seen. He remembered things. He would arrive on a Sunday afternoon and say, "You mentioned last time that your grandmother had been unwell. Has she improved?" And the specificity of that remembrance felt so much like care that I softened toward him in a way that took me several more visits to examine properly. But I began to notice, slowly, the way you notice a smell you can't place before you realize it's smoke, that his attention only ever moved in one direction. He asked about me and he listened to my answers. And then when I turned a question back toward him, he redirected it, gently, smoothly, with a kind of practiced ease that I could see only in retrospect. He was never at the center of any conversation we had. I was always the center, always the subject being discussed and cataloged and gently assessed, while he stayed perfectly opaque behind the questions. I ended that courtship myself. It was the first time I had refused something that the community around me considered a good opportunity, and the social consequence of that refusal was real and immediate. There were conversations I was no longer included in. There were women whose friendliness toward me cooled by a few degrees that I could feel, even if I couldn't have measured. But I ended it because something in me had finally found enough language to say that a man who keeps your eyes turned toward yourself while he remains entirely hidden is not a man who wants to know you. He is a man who wants to stay unknown, and he has found a flattering way to accomplish that. I want to pause here for a moment, because what I'm about to tell you about the fourth man is something I've carried quietly for a long time, and I don't want you to come to it without being ready for it. If you're finding something in this that feels like something you've lived inside yourself, I hope you'll subscribe and ring the bell, because what comes next is the part of this story I've never said out loud before. The fourth man arrived in my life at a moment when I was tired in a way I hadn't had words for yet. Tired of the visits, tired of the Sunday afternoon performances that called themselves something more natural than they were. Tired of the particular kind of loneliness that comes from sitting across from a person for weeks and understanding that you are not actually getting closer to knowing them, only closer to the point where a decision would need to be made. His name was Garrett, and within the first 30 minutes of our very first visit, he told me, with a quiet confidence that left no room for uncertainty, that he intended to have 7 children. Not as a hope or a prayer, the way most people in Cedar Crossing would have framed it, leaving the number to God's discretion. As a plan, stated with the same tone he would have used to tell me how many acres he expected to work in the spring. He had a clear picture of the life ahead of him, and it was detailed and well imagined and filled with purpose, and as he described it, I tried to find myself standing somewhere inside it. I couldn't. What I could see was the shape of a woman in that picture, a necessary presence in a life that had been designed before she arrived, a space built to the dimensions of a function rather than to the dimensions of a person. There are men like this in every close community, in every world built around tradition and order, men who have drawn up the full plans of a life and are looking for someone willing to move into the space they've left marked for her, a space that was built before they met her and would have been built the same way had they met someone entirely different. I said no to Garrett. He was courteous about it. I heard not long after that he was visiting someone else. I hope someone had told her. No one had told me because the same silence that kept us from speaking directly about our bodies and our feelings also kept us from passing along the useful, practical knowledge of what it felt like to sit across from a man who was inviting you into a life he'd already finished designing. The fifth man was named Reuben, and I want to take care here because Reuben became my husband, and the truth about him has never fit inside a simple sentence. I have learned in the years since I left Cedar Crossing that a simple truth about a real human being is almost always a sign that someone has decided to show you only the version that can be summarized neatly. Reuben was not the most polished of the five men. He brought no rehearsed small gifts, no smoothly delivered compliments about my family. He was quiet at the moments when the other men had been fluent, and he had a slightly awkward way of beginning conversations, as if the opening of things cost him more effort than the middle, the way certain people who are genuinely warm and deeply interesting are nonetheless uncomfortable walking into rooms full of strangers. In our first two visits, he said a number of things that didn't land quite right, not because they were unkind, but because he hadn't calibrated the timing, hadn't yet learned the particular rhythm of talking with me specifically. But here is what Reuben did that none of the other four ever did. He got something wrong in front of me in our third visit, and he did not try to manage it. He said something about what my father had expressed an opinion on, something he had picked up secondhand from a cousin, and I told him gently that he had it turned around, that my father actually believed the opposite. And Reuben stopped. He didn't deflect to a safer subject. He didn't smile and smooth it over with a quick pivot. He looked at me and said, "You're right, I had that wrong. That was all. No explanation, no recovery performance." He had said something incorrect and he acknowledged it, and then he simply remained in the room with me, the same person he had been before the error, as if being wrong about a thing was not a catastrophe requiring immediate management. I need you to understand what that meant inside the context I had grown up in. I had sat across from four men over the course of several years, men who were good at the performance of themselves, men who had understood, somewhere in the unspoken curriculum of courtship in Cedar Crossing, that you did not reveal your weak points, that you kept your surface smooth and your presentation consistent, that courtship was an audition, and you did not let the casting director see you forget your lines. Reuben appeared to have either never learned this curriculum or to have decided that following it was not something he was willing to do. And I still cannot tell you with certainty which of those two things was true, and I'm not sure it matters. The result was the same either way. For the first time across 5 courtships, I felt like I was sitting across from a person who was actually present rather than a carefully edited version of one. Before I move on, I want to say something to you directly because we're past the middle of this now. If this kind of telling is something you want more of, I hope you'll subscribe and turn on the bell. I'm trying to build something here, a record of the things a woman who grew up in that world is not supposed to know about her own experience, things I've spent years finding language for, and I don't want this to be the last story you see from me. Reuben and I married in early September in my 22nd year, which in Cedar Crossing was considered late enough that people had begun to wonder about me in ways they didn't say to my face. We moved into a small house on the east edge of the colony, with windows that looked out over the grain fields and a kitchen that got the morning light. The first years were not simple. The same silence that had shaped our courtship followed us inside the marriage, and there were things we did not say to each other at the kitchen table, things we did not know how to say because we had grown up in a world that had given us almost no vocabulary for the interior life. There were rooms in our life together, in the way I mean that word metaphorically, that we circled without entering because entering them would have required a fluency neither of us had been taught. What I know now from this distance, with several years of a counselor's office between me and the woman I was then, and a life rebuilt outside Cedar Crossing, is that courtship in a community like the one I grew up in is a system designed to produce marriages. It was not designed to produce honesty between two people or genuine knowledge of who they were agreeing to spend their lives with. The theology that undergirded it was concerned with order, with the right arrangement of roles, with a woman becoming a wife and a man becoming the head of a household. Whether those two people actually knew each other, whether they had any reliable access to who the other was beneath the performance, was not a question the system thought to ask. The silence in those common rooms on Sunday afternoons was never neutral, and I spent a long time believing it was. Silence in that kind of system is always protecting something. What it was protecting in our courtships was the performance itself. The socially approved, community reinforced presentation of suitability. Tobias performed ease and warmth. Eld performed steadiness. The third man performed attention and interest. Garrett performed certainty and vision. And because I had no permission to ask the questions that would have cracked the performance open, no language for naming what I was watching and why it made something in me uneasy, I sat across from each of them in turn and tried to feel my way through the dark towards something true. When I left Cedar Crossing at 26, the consequences came quickly and completely. Letters I wrote went unanswered, or arrived back to me through intermediaries in ways that made the distance clear. Phone calls rang into silence. My mother, who had sat at the same table through all 5 of those courtships, who had made tea and left the room at the right moments and asked me afterward what I thought, would not speak with me for more than a year. That silence lives somewhere in me still, on certain mornings, the way an old injury lives in the body. Not constant, but present, a kind of pressure that comes and goes with the weather. But here is what I carry with me out of all of it, and no one can take it from me. I carry the exact memory of what it felt like when the performance slipped. When Ruben said, "You're right," I had that wrong and then just stayed there, unhurried, looking at me without needing to manage what I thought about what had just happened. I carry that memory now like a tool, something I can hold up against any person I'm trying to understand in any room and ask myself quietly, are you here truly? Or are you giving me the version of yourself that has been edited for an audience? Is there a seam somewhere in this presentation? And what would I see if I found it and looked through? Our marriage had hard years and not hard years. Reuben was never easy in the way Tobias had been easy, but the ease Tobias offered had been a kind of weather, pleasant on the surface and meaningless underneath. Reuben's difficulty was the difficulty of a real person, which is different, which has texture and consequence and also has the possibility of genuine repair. We were not always good at repair. There were things I needed to say to him that I didn't know how to say for years because no one had taught me the words. There were things he needed from me that he couldn't name any better than I could name mine. But we were, at least, sitting across from each other. When I finally left the community, it was not because of Reuben, though some people in Cedar Crossing arranged the story that way because it was simpler. I left because I had spent years arriving at a question I couldn't make go away, which was, what would it mean to know myself fully, without the framework of Cedar Crossing telling me which parts of that knowing were permitted? And once I had asked it, I couldn't unask it. That is the thing about certain questions. They are irreversible. The asking of them changes the shape of the room you're standing in, and you cannot go back to the room as it was before. I don't tell any of this to condemn Cedar Crossing or the people who live there or the faith that holds them together. There was real kindness in that community, real care between people, real moments of grace that I carry with me the same way I carry the hard things, because both are true simultaneously. And I am suspicious of any account of a life that makes them incompatible. I tell this because somewhere, right now, there is a person sitting across a table from someone who is performing, who is giving a practiced, polished, socially approved version of themselves. And that person deserves to know what it looks like. They deserve to be able to name the feeling that something is being withheld, to trust that feeling rather than setting it aside because no one around them has given them permission to speak it. The crack in the performance is almost always small. It is almost never dramatic. It is the moment a person says, "I had that wrong," and doesn't look away. It is the moment someone lets you see something unmanaged, something that hasn't been shaped for your approval, something true rather than presented. Learn to notice that moment. Learn to wait for it before you decide. It might cost you time. In a world that is in a hurry to get you matched and settled and arranged, it might cost you more than time. But it is the thing most worth watching for, And once you've seen what the absence of it looks like, once you've sat across from four different presentations of a person and recognized them as presentations, you will not be satisfied with anything less. The story I spent years believing was about the five men. I understand now that the story was about the silence around them, the silence that made the performance possible, that gave it legitimacy, that allowed it to be indistinguishable from the truth for long enough that decisions got made before anyone could see clearly. I did not walk away from that silence knowing everything. I walked away with one memory, one moment, one small and unremarkable instance of a man saying, I got that wrong, and not turning away from what that meant. That was enough to build a measuring stick out of. It was enough to carry with me into every room I've sat in since. Choose the questions that break the performance open and ask them even if no one has given you the language to do it. Be willing to wait for the answer that can't have been rehearsed. It might be the thing that saves you.